The criterion of scientific proof is similar to that used in courtrooms, where decisions are made beyond a reasonable doubt. Unlike court cases, however, science places no limits on appeals to judgments. No Supreme Court exists as the final arbiter. No matter how long it takes, hundreds of years in the case of Newtonian mechanics, a theory can be supplanted by a new theory when the new theory does a better job of agreeing with the data. Note that I did not say that special relativity proved Newtonian mechanics wrong. The observed differences between the Einsteinian and Newtonian predictions are mostly only evident at speeds near the speed of light. Physical theories are just models that we put to use in helping us classify and predict observations. Newtonian mechanics remains perfectly useful and true at low relative velocities. It's what most students learn when they take physics, and what most professionals, such as engineers, use when they use physics. In any case, when I say that science has proved that God does not exist, I mean that a God with specific properties, whom I identify as God with a capital G, can be disproved scientifically beyond a reasonable doubt. We've already seen that science can prove any God's existence beyond a reasonable doubt simply by observing some phenomenon that we can rule out beyond a reasonable doubt as being natural, and we can associate with that God. One example I gave was the success of a specific type of intercessory prayer associated with one religion and no others. Another example was a revealed truth that can be verified scientifically and demonstrated to be unknowable by natural means, such as the successful prediction of some future event. Of course, we have not seen such proofs beyond a reasonable doubt of God's existence. On the other hand, I believe that a good case can be made that science can now state beyond a reasonable doubt that the Abrahamic God does not exist. While theologians might quibble about the attributes of God and the differences that exist between the Abrahamic religions and their various sects, it is beyond argument that the God worshipped and prayed to by Jews, Christians, and Muslims is an active participant in the world and in human lives. If we are to hypothesize the existence of such a God, we can then infer certain observations that should be detectable. If not, to be, hold on, if not to the naked eye in humans, then in the careful objective analysis of data from the highly sensitive instruments of science. In my 2007 book, God, the Failed Hypothesis, How Science Shows That God Does Not Exist, I made such a hypothesis and analyzed the observations that should have been made in order to verify that hypothesis. I will not repeat this analysis here. Suffice it to say that even the most devout believer must admit that science has not yet discovered any kind of God. My argument is simply that science, or even the human senses, should by now have turned up empirical evidence for a moral God who acts in the universe in any significant way. I qualified my statement above to refer only to a moral God, because we can hypothesize an immoral God who deliberately hides even from humans who are open to disbelief. Is any God consistent with science? We saw in chapter 1 that 44% of all Americans do not believe in a God who plays an important role in the world or in their personal lives. That is, they do not believe in the traditional Christian God. Rather than theism, their beliefs should be more accurately classified as deism. Deism originated during the 18th century age of enlightenment. Let me refer to that form of deism specifically as enlightenment deism, because a viable modern deism is forced by scientific developments to be something different. This was the first time in Western Christendom that educated people trusted reason over faith. Many of the most prominent of the founding fathers of the American Republic were deists, notably Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, and probably our first four presidents. The creator, whom Thomas Jefferson wrote into the Declaration of Independence, was the deist God. It made no sense to these rational thinkers that an all powerful, all knowing God would have to step in to make changes once he had set the universe in motion. In 1687, Isaac Newton had published his laws of gravity and motion, which allowed the prediction of the motion of any material body with knowledge of the initial position and velocity of the body and the force acting on it. This suggested the universe was a vast machine or clockwork with everything predetermined. Since God made these laws, the Enlightenment deists saw no reason for him to act further. If humans are made of material particles and nothing more, then Enlightenment deism implies that we have no free will. However, free will is still possible if we have immaterial souls that enable us to freely control our material bodies. Certainly, many humans, including deists, would argue vehemently from experience that they possess free will. Still, almost half of Americans are in tune with at least a version of the deism of the founding fathers. Perhaps deism has been around all along as an unacknowledged private feeling, the simple common sense that a perfect God who created the universe and its laws should never need to step in and make changes to events that are already predetermined. However, we can now, with a high degree of confidence, rule out Enlightenment deism. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle of quantum mechanics has shown that the motions of bodies contain an element of chance. Physicists cannot, in fact, predict their motions with unlimited accuracy. The universe is not a vast machine in which everything that happens is fully determined by what went on before. This still allows for the possibility of a God who built the universe and its laws, but who also added a large amount of randomness. In fact, this is just the God who plays dice whom Einstein refused to accept. Many theologians, including a number who have excellent scientific credentials, have approached the problem of reconciling science and religion by modifying theology so that it is consistent with the science. I have written sympathetically about them in the past because they are willing to accept science and not try to change it to suit their beliefs. Modern Christian theologians see the need to address the question of God's actions in the universe and have held a series of conferences on the subject at the Vatican. Several physics trained theologians have suggested that quantum mechanics and chaos theory provide possible mechanisms. However, as I discuss in detail in Quantum Gods, these mechanisms still require God to violate the laws of physics when he steps in to change the motion of bodies. Other theologians and theistic scientists have found almost no choice but to assert some version of a deist God without identifying it as such, the God who plays dice discussed above. In God, Chance, and Purpose, statistics scholar David Bartholomew elevates chance to be an integral part of God's creation, the means by which God achieves creativity in the world. This is still a deist God since the dice are tossed before the creation. So far, Bartholomew and the other deologians, if I may invent a word, have not been able to reconcile such a God with the Christian God, who, according to all Christian teachings, acts in the everyday world and must be worshipped and prayed to so that his actions are favorable. The design delusion. For most theists, one of the strongest arguments for the existence of God is the apparent design that they imagine they see in the universe and in living things. This argument from design is ancient, but it has surfaced in recent years in two forms that are scientific rather than philosophical. And so, these are inherently more capable of reaching a definitive conclusion since they're based on data and not reasoning from arguable premises. The new forms of the argument from design are as such. Number one, the argument from the evidence for fine-tuning of the universe, better known by the misleading designation, the anthropic principle. And two, the argument from the evidence for intelligent design in the complex structures of living organisms. Now, although the second one has received greater public attention, most science-savvy theologians agree with most scientists that intelligent design, or at least as it has been formulated so far, is a failure. Theologians are far more impressed by the fine-tuning argument, and they have received support from a number of prominent scientists who profess not to believers, or who profess not to be believers, but admit that the facts are puzzling and require explanation. On the level of physics and cosmology, theists claim that the universe is so finely tuned for life that any slight difference in the physical parameters and life would not have been possible. They conclude that this provides overwhelming evidence that the universe was designed for life, possibly even human life, and therefore a designer must exist. Although those making this argument quickly jump to the conclusion that the designer is their particular god that they worship, it could just as well be the deist god or some impersonal supernatural power, such as the Force in Star Wars, for example. Or perhaps the designer is a natural power somehow within the material universe. I have addressed the fine tuning arguments in a number of books and articles. However, the subject continues to develop, as do my responses, and I will not be too repetitive here. I'll discuss several important examples that I have not covered in these earlier writings. A logical argument. But before getting to the data, let me present the typical logical arguments for fine tuning and show how it fails. Remember, logic cannot be used to tell us something not already embedded in the postulates we assume when we begin the deductive process. However, it can be used to tell us that something is wrong because the postulates are unjustified or the argument is logically inconsistent. Let me play philosopher for a moment and try to state the fine tuning argument as a not too pedantic philosopher might do so. Here are the postulates. There exists only one universe, the one we live in. The physical parameters of our universe were not all fixed by some fundamental physical law. A huge variation in the ranges of the unfixed parameters was possible, making any given set highly unlikely by chance. Our universe possesses just those physical parameters that make life in our universe possible. Humans and other earthly life would not exist if our universe had slightly different parameters. Conclusions. If the universe did not have the parameters it does, we would not be here to talk about it. This is the weak anthropic principle and is a simple tautology. Because the set of parameters of our universe is so unlikely to have occurred by chance, it most probably occurred by design, with humanity part of that design. Here are the refutations. Not yet having a final theory of everything, we cannot know that more than one set of parameters is possible. Indeed, current string theory suggests on the order of 10 to the 500th power different possible sets of parameters. Number two, since our only experience is with our universe and its parameters, we have no way of knowing that a huge range of parameters is possible or anything about the distribution of those parameters so that any given set is unlikely by chance. Number three, since our only experience is with our universe and its parameters, we have no way of knowing what sets of parameters might still lead to some form of life different from ours, but just as complex and still containing intelligent beings. Number four, we have no reason to assume there aren't many universes. Even if our particular universe is highly unlikely, the chance that we are one of many could be as high as 100%. The multiple universe or multiverse scenario is severely criticized by theists as unobservable. Of course, God is unobservable too, so the best the theists can claim is a standoff. Actually, there are already some ideas about how we might detect the presence of other universes, but they're highly speculative and too technical to mention here. Less speculative are the theories that predict the multiverse, since these are part of science. Scientists theorize about the unobservable all the time, such as quarks and dark matter, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as the science being used is well established. In fact, we have good reasons to believe in the multiverse. As physicist Aurélien Barraud writes in his review of multiverse physics, the idea of of multiple universes is more than a fantastic invention. It appears naturally within several theories and deserves to be taken seriously. I strongly recommend this article because it will demonstrate that the multiverse is not just some vague atheist notion dreamed up to counter the fine tuning argument. It is sober mainstream physics. In conclusion, the fine tuning argument can be countered logically, but all I have proved is that the formulation of the fine tuning argument given above fails because several of the postulates cannot be justified. They might still be true, or some other formulation might be true. You just can't prove it's true. Let us take a different track and assume the postulates are true, and look at some of the scientific facts that lead science savvy theists and some non theistic scientists to still think that something funny is going on that they don't want to dismiss, as many more hard nosed types do, by just saying, well, that's the way it is. Here's the scientific arguments. A list of 34 parameters that seem to be fine tuned has been assembled by Rich Deem on the God and Science website. His main reference is physicist and Christian apologist Hugh Ross and his popular book, The Creator and the Cosmos, first published in 1993. Ross is the founder of Reasons to Believe, which is a self described international and interdenominational science faith think tank providing powerful new reasons from science to believe in Jesus Christ. A long list of claimed design evidences can be found on his website. Several of Deem's and Ross's constants, such as the speed of light in a vacuum, Newton's constant of gravity, and Planck's constant, are just arbitrary numbers that are determined simply by the system you are using. They can be set equal to any number you want except zero, with no impact on the physics. So no fine tuning can possibly be involved, just as the number pi is not fine tuned. Deem does not actually mention Planck's constant explicitly, but it comes in when he talks about the magnitude of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle being fine tuned so that oxygen transport to the cells is just right. The magnitude of the uncertainty principle is simply Planck's constant. We can safely assume that life evolved in such a way that the energy transport was just right, adjusting to the physical parameters such as they are. I will focus on the 5 parameters that have the most significance because, if interpreted correctly, they pretty much rule out almost any conceivable kind of life without fine tuning. Copying, with minor modifications, the table from Deem. Now, Deem does not give any references to scientific papers showing calculations for the maximum deviations listed in his table. However, I will admit that the features a universe would have for slightly different values of these parameters, all other parameters remaining the same, would render our form of life impossible. Indeed, this extends to any form of life, even remotely like ours. That is, one that is based on a lengthy process, chemical or otherwise, by which complex matter evolved from simpler matter. This is the main reason these parameters are significant. As we'll see below in all the other examples people give, some form of life is still possible, just not our form specifically. Now let me discuss each in turn. Note that the arguments all apply to our universe, where we assume that none of the laws of physics are different. All that is different in the value of some of the numbers we put into those laws, so we're not making any assumptions about other universes. Ratio of electrons to protons. The claim is that if the ratio of the numbers of electrons to protons were larger, electromagnetism would dominate our gravity and galaxies would not form. If smaller, gravity would dominate and chemical bonding would not occur. This assumes the ratio is some arbitrary constant. In fact, the number of electrons equals exactly the number of protons for a very simple reason. The universe is electrically neutral, so the two, having opposite charges, must balance. Here is a clear but slightly technical explanation for how this all came about in the early universe from a book by astronomer Pete Schneider. Before pair annihilation, the time when most electrons annihilated with anti-electrons or positrons producing photons, there were about as many electrons and positrons as there were photons. After annihilation, nearly all electrons were converted into photons, but not entirely, because there was a very small excess of electrons over positrons to compensate for the positive electric charge density of the protons. Therefore, the number density of electrons that survived the pair annihilation is exactly the same as the number density of protons for the universe to remain electrically neutral. So, no fine-tuning happened here. The ratio is determined by conservation of charge, a fundamental law of physics. Ratio of electromagnetic force to gravity. The source of the huge difference in strengths between the electromagnetic and gravitational forces of a proton and an electron has been a long-standing problem in physics, first being mentioned by Hermann Weyl in 1919. If they were anywhere near each other, stars would collapse long before they could provide either the materials needed for life on planets or the billions of years of stable energy needed for life to evolve. You would expect a natural number to be on the order of magnitude of 1. So why is it n1 equals 10 to the 39th power? But note that N1 is not some universal measure of the relative strength of the electrical and gravitational forces. It's just the force ratio for a proton and an electron. The proton is not even an elementary particle. It's made of quarks. For two electrons, the ratio is 10 to the 10 to the 42nd power. If we have two unit charged particles, yeah, each with a mass of 1.85 times 10 to the negative ninth power kilograms, the two forces would be equal. So the large value of N1 is simply an artifact of the use of small masses in making the comparison. The ratio force is hardly fine-tuned to 39 orders of magnitude, as you will read in the theist literature. The reason N1 is so large is that elementary particle masses are so small. According to our current understanding of the nature of mass, elementary particles all have zero bare mass and pick up a small effective mass by interacting with the background Higgs field that pervades the universe. That is, their masses are naturally very small. If particle masses were not so small, we would not have a long-lived, stable universe and wouldn't be here to talk about it. This is an expression of the anthropic principle, but note that I am not invoking it, I'm just explaining it. Several physicists, including myself, have done computer simulations where we generate universes by varying all the relevant parameters. In my case, I randomly varied the electromagnetic force strength, the mass of the proton, and the mass of the electron by 10 orders of magnitude around their existing values in our universe. The gravitational force strength was fixed. That is, I allowed the ratio of forces to vary from 10 to the 34th power to 10 to the 44th power. These are a long way from 10 to the 39th power. I found that over half of the universes generated had stars with lifetimes of at least 10 billion years, long enough for life of some kind to evolve. In a more recent study, I've also varied the strength of the strong nuclear force and placed further limitations on the characteristics of the generated universes. For example, I ensure that atoms are much bigger than nuclei and have much lower binding energy. I have demanded that planetary days be at least 10 hours long and stars be far more massive than planets. I find that 20% of the universes have these properties. My study was rather simple. More advanced studies, which reach the same basic conclusion, have been made by Anthony Aguirre, Ronnie Harnick, Graham Cribbs, Gilles Perez, and Fred Adams. Okay. Expansion rate of the universe. The fine-tuning of the expansion rate of the universe is one of the most frequent examples given by theologians and philosophers. Dean says that if it were slightly larger, no galaxies would form. If it were smaller, the universe would collapse. This has an easy answer. If the universe appeared from an earlier state of zero energy, then energy conservation would require the exact expansion rate that is observed. That is, the rate determined precisely by the fact that the potential energy of gravity is exactly balanced by the kinetic energy of matter. Let me try to explain this in detail so that once again it's clear that I am merely stating a simple fact of physics. Suppose we wish to send a rocket from Earth to far outside the solar system. If we fire the rocket at exactly 11.2 kilometers per second, what is called the escape velocity for Earth, its kinetic energy will exactly equal the negative of its gravitational potential energy, so the total energy will be zero. As the rocket moves away from Earth, the rocket gradually slows down. its kinetic energy decreases, as does the magnitude of its potential energy, the total energy remaining constant at zero because of energy conservation. Eventually, when the rocket is very far from Earth and the potential energy approaches zero, its speed relative to Earth also approaches zero. If we fired the rocket at just under escape velocity, the rocket would slow to a stop sooner and eventually turn around and return to Earth. Okay. If we fired it at slightly higher speed, the rocket would keep moving away and never stop. In the case of the Big Bang, the bodies in the universe are all receding from one another at such a rate that they will eventually come to rest at a vast distance. The rate of expansion is very precisely set by the fact that the total energy of the system was zero at the very beginning and energy is conserved. So, instead of being an argument for God, the fact that the rate of expansion of the universe is exactly what we'd expect from an initial state of zero energy is a good argument against God. Once again, we have no fine tuning because because the parameter in question is determined by by a conservation principle. In this case, the conservation of energy. Mass density of the universe. If the mass density of the universe were slightly larger, then overabundance of the production of deuterium, which is a heavy hydrogen. I guess I said that right, deuterium. That's what it looked like I said. From the Big Bang would cause stars to burn too rapidly for life on planets to form. If smaller, insufficient helium from the Big Bang would result in a shortage of the heavy elements needed for life. The answer is the same as the previous case. The mass density of the universe is precisely determined by the fact that the universe starts out with zero total energy. Cosmological constant. This is considered one of the major unanswered problems in physics. The cosmological constant is a term that arises in Einstein's general theory of relativity. It's basically equivalent to the energy density of empty space that results from any curvature of space. It can be positive or negative. If positive, it produces a repulsive gravitational force that accelerates the expansion of the universe. For most of the 20th century, it was assumed that the cosmological constant was identically zero, although no known law of physics specified that. At least no astronomical observations indicated otherwise. But then in 1998, two independent groups studying supernovas in distant galaxies discovered, to their great surprise, since they were looking for the opposite, that the expansion of the universe was accelerating. This result was soon confirmed by other observations, including those made with the Hubble Space Telescope. The component of the universe responsible for the acceleration was dubbed dark energy. Dark energy constitutes 73% of the total mass of the universe. The natural assumption is to attribute the acceleration to the cosmological constant, and the data so far seem to support that interpretation. Theorists had earlier attempted to calculate the cosmological constant from basic quantum physics. The result they obtained was 120 orders of magnitude larger than the maximum value obtained from astronomical observations. Now, this is indeed a problem, but it certainly does not imply that the cosmological constant has been fine-tuned by 120 orders of magnitude. What it implies is that physicists have made a stupid, dumbass, wrong calculation that has to be the worst calculation in physics history. Clearly, the cosmological constant is small, possibly even zero. This can happen in any number of ways. If the early universe possessed, so many propose, a property called supersymmetry, then the cosmological constant would have been exactly at zero at that time. It can be shown that if negative energy states, already present in the calculation for the cosmological constant, are not simply ignored but counted in the energy balance, then the cosmological constant will also be identically zero. Other sources of cosmic acceleration have been proposed, such as a field of neutral material particles pervading the universe that has been dubbed quintessence. This field would have to have a negative pressure, but if it is sufficiently negative, it will be gravitationally repulsive. In short, the 5 greatest fine-tuning proposals show no fine-tuning at all. The five parameters considered by most theologians and scientists to provide the best evidence for design can all be plausibly explained. There are just three just follow from conservation principles, which argue against rather than for any miraculous creation of the universe. They can be turned around and made into arguments against rather than for God. Answers can be given for all the other parameters on Deem's lists. Not a single one rules out some kind of life, and the analysis allows other parameters to vary. The same can be said about other compilations of parameters that appear at first glance to be fine-tuned. Even some of the most respected scientists have made the mistake of declaring a parameter fine-tuned by only asking what happens when it is varied while other parameters remain the same. A glaring example is provided by Sir Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal of the United Kingdom. In his popular book, Just Six Numbers, Rees claims that a quantity he calls nuclear efficiency, defined as the fraction of mass of helium that is less than 2 protons and 2 neutrons, is fine-tuned. He says that the deuterium would be unstable because the nuclear force would not be strong enough to keep the electrical repulsion between protons from blowing it apart. If the value were a little different, the nuclear force would be strong enough to bind 2 protons together directly, and there would be no need for neutrons and to provide additional attraction. In that case, there would be no deuterium or any other nuclei containing neutrons. But this all assumes a fixed strength of the electromagnetic force, which is given by the dimensionless parameter A, which has a value of 1 by 137 in the existing universe. In the first case, for any value of A less than 1/160th, the deuteron will be stable because the electrical repulsion will be too weak to split it apart. In the second case, for any value of A greater than 1/120th, the electrical repulsion will be too great for protons to bind together without the help of neutrons, so deuterons and other neutron-rich nuclei will exist. So, stable nuclei are possible for a wide range of the two parameters E and A, and are neither fine-tuned for life. Let me mention one parameter where the answer to the claim of fine-tuning is ridiculously simple. The masses of neutrinos are supposedly fine-tuned since their gravitational effects would be too big or too small if they were different, and this would adversely affect the formation of stars and galaxies. But that assumes that the number of neutrinos in the universe is fixed. It isn't. It is determined by their masses. If heavier, there would be fewer. If lighter, there would be more. Whatever the masses, the gravitational effects of neutrinos would be the same. In short, there is no scientific basis for the claim that the universe is fine-tuned for life. Indeed, the whole notion makes no sense. Why would humanity live on the knife edge of extinction? This God made a vast universe that is mostly empty space and then confined humankind to a tiny speck of a planet where it is destined for extinction long before the universe becomes inert. He could have made it possible for us to live anywhere. He could have made it possible to live in any conceivable universe with any values for its parameters, instead of being an argument for the existence of God. The apparent fine-tuning of the constants of physics argues against any design in the cosmos. Earthly design. I saw your ear move. I need to rewarm my coffee. You know what would be really cool? Is if you could do that for me. But given that you're a cat, you're kind of useless. All right, let us now move to the question of design as it is imagined by theists to be empirically evident in living things on Earth. By now, the history must be well known to readers, so I will By now, the history must be well known to readers, so I will only briefly summarize that story and bring up a few new wrinkles. Although it can be traced back to antiquity, the argument from design received its most significant boost from the work of Archdeacon William Paley in Natural Theology, first published in 1802. Paley compared a rock to a watch and noted that the watch was clearly an artifact. He then argued that the human body was an artifact, like the watch. The argument from design was originally a God of the gaps argument when science had no explanation for how the complexity of life arose naturally. When, 50 years after Paley in 1859, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace showed how complex biological systems can evolve from simpler ones by means of natural selection, the argument from design evolved from a God of the gaps into an argument from ignorance. There no longer was a gap. When used today, it is given in the form, I can't see how life can have happened naturally, therefore it must have been magic. Evolution immediately came under attack from religious spokesmen because it clearly conflicted with Genesis, and it remains under attack today from those who read the Bible literally. Since the Catholic Church's ultimate authority is not the Bible, but the Pope, it has found it easier to accept the verdict of science. Some proponents of evolution, such as the late famed paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, see no conflict with religion. They jumped with joy when they read in 1996 that Pope John Paul II had declared that evolution is more than a hypothesis. The Pope seemed to say that evolution was now an established fact. However, as it turned out, what he said was quite the opposite. In his message of October 22nd, 1996, to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, John Paul II refers to Encyclical Humani Generis, composed by his predecessor Pius XII, as stating that there was no opposition between evolution and the doctrine of the faith about man and his vocation, on condition that one did not lose sight of several indisputable points. In his message, John Paul II actually hedged considerably on his acceptance of evolution, implying that it has not yet been validated and there is more than one hypothesis in the theory. When this message first came out, the translation read, evolution is more than a hypothesis, which evolution enthusiasts gleefully interpreted as the Pope's strong support for evolution as fact, not just theory. A full reading of the message, however, makes it clear that the Holy Father was claiming that there are several theories of evolution that are still under dispute, hardly the position of today's evolutionists. Further, John Paul II elaborated on what Pius XII had called indisputable points. These had to do with soul and mind. Again, referring to Pius XII, John Paul II says, if the human body takes its origin from pre-existent living matter, the spiritual soul is immediately created by God. Consequently, theories of evolution, which, in accordance with the philosophers inspiring them, consider the mind as emerging from the forces of living matter or as a mere epiphenomenon of this matter, are incompatible with the truth about man, nor are they able to ground the dignity of the person.